Very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be back in Glentees. It's always a pleasure. I think it's about the 105th time I've been on a panel with Pat Leahy, so that's always an honour. And I'm delighted to be here, and thanks again to Joe, to the organising committee, and also to the whole community, who I think make everybody feel really, really welcome when we come here, sort of taking the place by storm for these few days every July. I think Noel Dempsey might actually be auditioning for a candidate position for Renew Ireland, because pretty much everything he has outlined as a solution to the malaise in our system of governance is already Renew Ireland policy. We have a policy of full open disclosure. It was met with much derision, I might say, when we proposed that cabinet minutes should be published, that the AG's advice where it relates to non-commercially sensitive information be published, and that ultimately that we trust our citizens with information that pertains directly to decisions that affect them, their lives and our state. We've also proposed a total overhaul of our electoral system. We advocate for a mixed list system, so an open list system combined with directly elected single seat constituencies. And the list goes on. We have a whole package around electoral reform and political reform, and I think Noel has done a very good job of outlining most of it there. I want to, you have to go through the normal candidate procedures, by the way. No favours, no fast tracking. Everybody starts on an even footing. I suppose what I wanted to focus a little bit on today is events of recent weeks. I think it's been, in some ways, very depressing and predictable, in other ways illuminating, following the proceedings at the banking inquiry. And I think, interestingly, after a 4-hour hearing with one Mr. Bertie Ahern last week, it was actually not until the radio interview yesterday with Miriam O'Callaghan, which I'm sure some of you heard, it wasn't until then that the Irish people really got to the kernel of how Irish politics created our financial crisis. When asked about the failure of financial regulation, Bertie Ahern told Miriam and her listeners that, and I quote, "We brought in the legislation, but we do not control what happens." In fact, according to the Bertie school of thought, it was not the Taoiseach's responsibility to safeguard against a banking collapse or to monitor how the banks are being regulated at all. It was the financial regulator's job. And it wasn't even Bertie's job to keep an eye on what he was doing. This, according to Bertie Ahern yesterday, was the responsibility of an Oireachtas committee. I think this is curious. It's certainly a new form of revisionism. It's the type, however, that communicates perfectly just how inadequate our political system is, and in equal measure expresses the true level of responsibility Taoiseach and ministers feel they are accountable for. There were 3 Oireachtas committee hearings that the financial regulator attended between 2003 and 2008, at a time when credit growth in Ireland exploded from €16 billion in mortgages to €106 billion, and commercial property loans went from €45 billion to €125 billion. These were hearings of the Public Accounts Committee, which was charged only with examining how the regulator was spending its money, rather than how it was supervising our banks. That wasn't its function. 2 other Oireachtas committees, the Joint Committee on Finance and Public Service and the Committee on Economic Regulatory Affairs, had hearings where the financial regulator attended during our period of credit boom. During this period, these Oireachtas committees met with the prudential regulator once in 2005 and once again in April 2008. On the 19th of January 2005, the Joint Committee on Finance and Public Service called the financial regulator in to answer questions about the publication of reports around overcharging to consumers and the provision of advice for tax evasion in AIB and National Irish Bank in the late 1990s. At that committee hearing, Patrick Neary spoke about how, and I quote, "One of the essential measures should be to what extent the banks have shown their support of ethical standards and have contributed to a proper culture in the organisation." He went on to say that we would like to see that culture being established in organisations rather than emphasis on the bottom line. Somewhat prophetic. That was the only time an Oireachtas committee met with the Prudential Regulator in 2005. Neither of these Oireachtas committees met with the regulator in 2003, 2004, 2006 or 2007. And it wasn't until April 2008 that the Committee on Economic Regulatory Affairs invited Patrick Neary in again, 4 months before the bank guarantee was announced. And at this hearing, the Fianna Fáil TD Sean Arda asked the financial regulator Patrick Neary about his website and what the regulator had done to inform the market about what he asserted to be misinformation that led to short selling of Irish banks on St Patrick's Day. The first question which Leo Varadkar asked, who was also a member of the committee, was what Mr Neary's views were in relation to his authority also regulating VHI health insurance. Very few, indeed no questions, related to the health of the Irish bank balance sheets back in April 2008, or indeed whether the regulator was keeping any sort of a close eye on their health. Mr Neary did note, when asked about property exposure within the banks, that, and I quote, "It should not just be left for the loan to be taken out on the value of the site or unfinished business. Inevitably, one or two examples may end up like that, but in the vast majority of cases, lending should be based on the underlying business, cash flow and take-out of a loan." Of course, we know now that this is precisely how banks were lending their money. And it is fairly jaw-dropping that the person charged with the precise function of understanding how the banks were lending money appears to have been utterly and totally ignorant to even this reality. At that hearing in April 2008, Mr Neary informed the Oireachtas Committee, the same committee which Bertie Ahern says was the entity responsible for overseeing what Mr Neary was at, that, and again I quote, "There is no evidence that lending for speculative property development starved other sectors of resources," and that he had no sense of what was happening. It is true that the financial regulator appeared to have no evidence of anything because they never actually understood who, what or how the banks were lending. The Oireachtas was, for its part, not very concerned either. A blind trust seems to have existed that the financial regulator was doing what his title suggested, and that was, obviously, regulating. When Brian Cowan came before the banking inquiry, he admitted that between September 2004 until May 2008, when he was the Minister for Finance, he met with the regulator only 3 times. This was once more than the Oireachtas Committee during this period. If Brian Cowan, who, according to Bertie, probably shouldn't have even been meeting with the regulator because it was overstepping his role, such was the independence of his office, or perhaps the importance of the Oireachtas Committee, I'm not quite clear, he had in fact met Patrick Neary more than 3 times in the 5 years of our credit boom. Perhaps our crisis could have been prevented, or would it? Clearly, to me at least, the answer is no, it wouldn't. Would Brian Cowan or an Oireachtas committee have asked Patrick Neary, how many people did you employ to keep an eye on bank balance sheets? If more people were looking and they actually understood the unsustainable business models of our banks, what would our financial regulator have done? Would he have told our finance minister that in fact the Celtic Tiger was built on sand? Just, I suppose, for argument's sake, to imagine that he did do that, what would the Minister for Finance have done? Would he have taken action? Bertie's continued story, both at the inquiry and indeed on the Miriam O'Callaghan show, is that he wishes that somebody had told him about the state of the banks. But what would he have done if he had been told? Would he have told Brian Cowen to slow down our economic growth? Would he tell the regulator? Or would he legislate to curtail the amount of credit being lent in our economy? I think it can be safely said that Brian Cowen and Bertie Ahern would have done nothing differently. No matter how much information Bertie and Brian Cowen had about the concentration of lending to individual borrowers or the amount of credit which was being lent to the economy at such a rapid rate, or in many cases the reckless way in which banks were lending, I think it's impossible to believe that anything would have been different. Even now, after all of the pain and suffering that we've gone through, there has been almost unanimous political groupthink in opposition to the central bank's recent measures to curb mortgage lending. This is in large part due to what politicians are hearing on the doorstep and in their clinics about the difficulties young families are facing in getting a mortgage. It is difficult. Those difficulties are real. It's a concern for them. It's a more pressing concern for them than, for example, the long-term fiscal and financial stability of our system. The opposition we hear to the central bank's attempts now to curb mortgage lending are the exact same voices that would have been listened to, whether it was in Fagan's pub or whether it was in a clinic in Offaly. And these are the voices which ultimately led to decisions on spending splurges and property tax relief binges. If we had a financial regulator who actually had the capacity and the foresight to see the future risks developing in our banks in 2003, if he had attempted to curb lending or implement greater controls, such was the politics at the time that the minister would simply have probably removed or redeployed him to some other area where he couldn't pose any political problems. And sadly, that was the political reality then, and it is the political reality today. Nothing has changed. The independence of state offices are only respected by Taoiseach and ministers when things go wrong, or indeed if they're not posing political problems. They then become very convenient ways to deflect and to apportion blame. So, for example, the independence of the Gardaí is respected until, of course, whistleblowers come along or ministers start to pose political problems for a government. We saw that in the not-too-distant past. IBRC was an independent bank, left to run its affairs famously at arm's length, according to Minister Noonan. The sale of SiteServe to Dennis O'Brien was a matter for IBRC. But when IBRC sold its large US loan portfolio, the public was told it was because of ministerial intervention. It was a great government achievement. There's a certain case of having your cake and eating it. NAMA is an independent entity, and any scandals about bribes in Northern Ireland politicians are, of course, a matter for the Northern Ireland Police Force and NAMA, independent of the Irish government. NAMA supplying houses or apartments for social housing, however, or tackling the problem of homelessness is something that the Minister for Finance has directed them to do. The truth is, our financial crisis was caused by weak legislation, weak regulation, but above all, by a cowardly political system that was all things to all people. Irish politics does not merely dislike the barking watchdog. More often than not, its default response is to attempt to strangle it. So how do we overcome this? Well, there are a number of things that we can do. I do believe that we need to transform our electoral system, our system in terms of how our parliament functions and so on. But I think that if we are serious, our government must empower our police force to have the necessary resources to identify, to prosecute and to prevent the type of financial crimes and fraud that embedded a culture of greed in our financial system. Nothing has happened in that regard. Secondly, we should put new crimes on the statute book. My party, Renua, in government will, as a red line issue, make reckless lending a crime in this country. The Circuit Court Judge Nolan, in the only Anglo trial that has in fact come to an end, said when sentencing the two bankers that the financial regulator had led the two convicted bankers into, quote, error and illegality. Nobody from the financial regulator has ever been charged for leading these bankers into the crimes they committed. A robust white-collar enforcement regime would challenge all of that. That is a priority for me, and it's something that we need to see implemented very soon. Finally, we should elect politicians who swear an oath of responsibility or allegiance to the entire state and not just to the constituents who got them there. This should be a constitutional obligation for all of our politicians. Public servants who fail should be held accountable for their failings, not scapegoated to serve political narratives. The buck stops with the Taoiseach, to go back to the Truman quote. And below him, the Minister, and below them, the Secretary-General, the Governor, the Regulator and the CEOs. All of these people, where the arm of the state imposes its will, should be accountable to our Parliament, and their failings land at the feet of the Executive. Our political and legal system needs to reflect that reality. Scandals, not distant scandals, recent scandals in the lifetime of this government, NAMA, IBRC, the sacking of the Garda Commissioner, the local McNulty scandal, all derive from the same political culture that was supposed to be replaced in 2011, but wasn't. So instead of glib remarks to the effect that if hindsight could be foresight and so on, Ireland needs a politics that promotes the courage of its convictions now, rather than a permanent and endless inquiry into the failings of the past. Thank you.